Anika, are you doing our introductions?
Nick, do I need to turn my mic on here myself, or does it happen by magic somewhere else?
Yeah, if you're willing to just turn it off
Yeah.
right now, then I'll keep it off in the system, and then I can control it from here.
It's like how many people does it take to screw in a light bulb?
You're set.
Perfect. Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Anika Rao. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is titled Politics on Campus, Yes and No. We want to thank Alexander Norton and his team at the National Review Institute for their partnership on this event. Now it is my honor to introduce today's speaker. Jay Nordlinger is a senior editor of National Review and also a fellow at the National Review Institute. In addition, he is the music critic of the News Criterion. He writes about a variety of subjects, including politics, foreign affairs, and human rights. Since 2002, he has hosted a series of public interviews at the Salzburg Festival. He writes a column called Impromptus for the nationalreview.com and is the host of two podcasts, Q&A and Music for a While. In 2011, he filmed The Human Parade with Jay Nordlinger, a TV series bringing hour-long interviews with various personalities. He's the author of two books, Peace, They Say, A History of the Nobel Peace Prize, and Children of Monsters, an inquiry into the sons and daughters of dictators. His journalism has been collected in two books, Here, There, and Everywhere, and Digging In. A native Michigander, Mr. Nordlinger lives in New York. Please join me in welcoming our guest.
Thank you very much. You're Anika Rao.
Yes.
Wonderful. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. I don't know if you intended to, but I'm here anyway. So I appreciate seeing you and being on this beautiful, beautiful campus. I put my watch up here so don't go too long and bore you to tears. I have some notes for you, but we can go off notes too, if you want. And I look forward to a vigorous Q&A, if that's what you like. So as Anika mentioned, this talk is titled Politics on Campus, Yes and No. And note the wording, not yes or no, but yes and no. So I say yes and no, mainly no, for reasons I can explain, but I'm not sure you could have told me that when I was a student. Politics is obviously very important. Government is important. I have spent much of my career as a political journalist. So obviously I don't look down my nose at politics or think it's unimportant or stupid or not worth one's time. That's not true at all. I wanted to quote something to you that George Will said. We did a podcast the other week. And I wrote down something he said about politics. He was talking about his hero, or one of his heroes in life, James Madison. I think his primary hero was Lincoln, which is fitting, but not far behind is James Madison. And Will said he wasn't a political philosopher primarily, he was a politician. And if you look at Madison, you see the melding of the philosophic instinct with the craft of politics. I happen to think politics is wonderful. It's about how we live together. The problem with the human race is that we're egotistical and opinionated. Everyone thinks his opinions are best. So the question is, how do we get people prickly human creatures, these featherless bipeds, as Plato called us, to live together. That's a real problem, and the answer is politics, so we better get it right. The stakes are really high. I agree with every word of that. At the same time, I think it's important that politics not be the be-all, end-all. You know, all politics and no play makes Jack a dull boy. There are other things in life. I think there ought to be a private sphere or an apolitical sphere, if you like. When I was your age, there was a slogan, a popular slogan, the personal is political. And part of my formation politically was to reject this. I said, no, not everything need be soaked in politics, but there's a certain mentality that says everything is political. The clothes you wear, the food you eat, the music you listen to, the slang you use, the friends you make. And I really think this is a very tiresome way to live, you know, to have politics on the brain. I'm a pretty political fellow, but you just got to take a break now and then and relax. My old friend, William F. Buckley Jr., the founder of National Review, would say, beware of being a totalist, of being a 24-hour ideologue. You know, pass the salt, politics. Today is Wednesday, politics, and constant politics. I had a couple thoughts about food. So we had pizza today, and I remember there was a time when some people I knew, they wouldn't eat Domino's pizza. Now, Domino's pizza originated in the place of my birth, I think, Ypsilanti, Michigan, and it was an Ann Arbor, Michigan company. That's where I'm from. And the founder of Domino's, Tom Monahan, was a big pro-lifer. And so a lot of people boycotted Domino's pizza. And I remember I was talking with a friend of mine once, many years ago, about Ben & Jerry's, that wonderful ice cream. And the owners were left-wing, they contributed to left-wing causes, we were right-wing. And we thought, you know, no, we don't want to be a 24-hour ideologue. You know, we're not communists here. Ben & Jerry's ice cream is fantastic. Why deny ourselves it? Now, I understand reasoning on the other side, but I just think food ought to be food sometimes, music ought to be music, clothes ought to be clothes, without politics. I remember a time when people I worked with were making fun, because it was new at the time, of avocado toast. They said that was for Brooklyn hipsters. Well, it's also avocado and toast. You know, not everything need be freighted with politics. You take my point. We're in a very hot, I would say, combustible political time right now. More combustible than most political times. And this has put a strain on friendships. It's put a strain on alliances. I know of marriages that it's put a strain on, and not just famous ones. And by the way, I knew both George and Kellyanne Conway before they were married. And it's sort of a rotten time. And you may know this expression, the big sort. People are sorting themselves out politically. They're living with the like-minded only. So blue jerseys live with other blue jerseys, and red jerseys live with other red jerseys, and it's the big sort. This is something to be worried about. My friend David French wrote a book called Divided We Fall. It's about polarization, but his original title was The Great American Divorce. Are we experiencing something like a split here? There's an old song, I can't remember whether it's a spiritual or a gospel song. Everywhere I go, somebody talking about Jesus. Everywhere I go, people are talking about politics. As never before in my life. In every nook and cranny of life. And so I think this kind of thing needs to be watched, that it doesn't get too hot. And thinking back into the past, I've made notes on this before, we've had these convulsive periods. I'll give you one from Britain that some older English friends of mine were telling me about. This is something I wrote some time ago. In Britain, the Suez Crisis of 1956 convulsed society. People stopped going out. They stopped issuing invitations and accepting them. Friendships were severed. Rancor filled the air. Clarissa Eden, wife of the Prime Minister, was quoted as saying, I have the impression that the Suez Canal is flowing through my drawing room. I also did some writing about the Sacco and Vanzetti case in the 1920s. This split the American population. These two men, Italian immigrants and anarchists, were accused of murder. And I'll quote John Dos Passos, the great journalist and novelist, once one of the most famous writers in America, now forgotten pretty much. He was pretty close to a household name. He wrote this: "The case left an immense bitterness between those who believed the men were innocent and those who believed they were guilty." Dos Passos also said, "I remember receiving a letter from a man I'd liked and admired and been on friendly terms with in college, formally breaking off relations. Since we hadn't seen each other for many years, and he lived on one side of the country and I on the other, it puzzled me that he should have taken the trouble. Undoubtedly, he felt he was doing his duty as a citizen." Now, this is before email and text messaging and Instagram and all this. By the way, I myself received such a letter about a year ago, an email from someone I'd known, sort of formally breaking with me. That was a little tough to take. I would say that college campuses are a special challenge because, there's so much excitability on a college campus. Some years ago, I went to Brown University because some students had told me something about their university, that a bunch of students had formed a secret Facebook group. I didn't know there were secret, but at least in those days, I don't know about Facebook, but in those days, there were three kinds of group: public, closed, or secret. This was secret, and people of all political stripes belonged to it, left, right, and center. But the thing is, they could talk openly about political issues and issues affecting campus without being censored, hooted at, canceled, and so on. A place where they felt they could talk openly. It was an underground kind of thing, and they felt they couldn't have such discussions above ground. Also, I was asked to speak at the Tufts Republicans Club, Tufts in Medford, Massachusetts. It was interesting that there were a couple of Democrats and one left-winger attending. They attended every meeting because they said you could talk about things, even very controversial things, contentious things, but people wouldn't disown you or ostracize you and so on. They felt comfortable there. So we talked about issues. Another time, I don't know if you've heard of Hillsdale College, but it's a college in Michigan, and it is self-consciously conservative. It's a conservative university, college, I guess, Hillsdale College, yes, and campus. And so I was having lunch or dinner with some of the students, and I said, "So you're all on the right. Do people argue about things? Are there any issues of debate and so on?" They said, "Oh, yes," they said. "Libertarians argue with traditionalists, and above all, Catholics argue with Protestants." I thought, oh, great. That's all we need, religious wars on campus. I guess it's natural to people to factionalize and tribalize. So even when you have basically like-minded people, I suppose those like-minded people will factionalize. And there's a joke that relates to this. It's a long joke, and I won't tell it. It's a very good joke, but I'll sort of cut to the chase. A man is shipwrecked, and he's on a desert island for some years, and is finally rescued by a passing American naval vessel. And the captain or admiral goes ashore. And the man with the materials on the island has built a little town or village. And he's built a school and a courthouse and a museum, maybe a church. And there are two synagogues. And the captain said, "Why are there two synagogues?" And the man said, "Oh, that's the one I go to. And that's the one I wouldn't set foot in if it were the last place on earth." I tell this joke because it's just very human. I personally, and you may disagree with me, feel free. I'm not a great one for politics on campus because I think these years should be spent learning, soaking in everything, tasting everything you can, building a foundation, reading everything left, right, and center, just stuffing oneself with knowledge. Now, I don't say that learning doesn't go on later in life. It certainly does, all types of learning. But formal education, the years are so they're so fleeting. There's only so much time, maybe 4 years or so, which to gobble this stuff up. And then life gets crowded with employment and other things. And so I don't think it's necessary to be so political in college years. I wish I'd been less political, frankly. Easy for an older person to say, it's hard to tell a younger person. But the way I view it is you build up your bank account, so to speak, of things you know. You make deposits. And then you make withdrawals on what you know for the rest of your life for particular purposes. And I sometimes say this is mainly tongue-in-cheek, but there's some truth to it. And I wouldn't say it if it weren't at least somewhat true. I spent from ages like 0 to 30 reading like crazy, reading like a banshee. And then since that time, and one of my excuses is it's hard to read and write at the same time. You have to do one or the other. And so what's my pitch or my point here? It's such a privilege to be in college and have the time to read and learn. And it's okay not to be terribly political. You know, I'm for a balanced college life. Some arts and humanities, some math and sciences, not that I ever did any of that, wish I had, big gap in my learning. Social sciences, sports, parties, politics, sure, but I would say in moderation. Another thing I caution is, you know how when the plane is landing, or right before, or right after, I can't remember, the flight attendant will say, be careful, exercise caution when opening overhead bins, luggage may have shifted in transit. You may find that your luggage, your views, will shift in transit. Mine did. What you're absolutely sure of on Monday, you might be less sure of on Tuesday, and so on and so forth. You don't have to freeze yourself in politics now. We all learn stuff, and then we observe the world, and we adjust. I have in my notes here something about majorities and minorities, and I think it's very important to be sensitive to minorities, especially political or philosophical ones. Majorities can be bullying. Majorities can lord it over others. You know who favors free speech? Minorities, whoever they are. Because majorities are, they're in the saddle, they're riding high. You know who favors academic freedom? People in political or philosophical minorities. People in majorities often aren't so hot on academic freedom. And I'll tell you, my great dear friend who's meant so much in my life, William F. Buckley Jr., his first book was God and Man at Yale, published in 1950. That's the book on which he made his fame, at least his initial fame. I never heard him talk about that book much. But the subtitle is On the Superstition of Academic Freedom. And academic freedom in sneer quotes or ironical quotes. So this is something to be mindful of, that everyone is entitled to speech. And sometimes majorities are reluctant to grant such a right, if grant's the right word. If they're natural rights, they can't be granted, can they? To minorities. This is something to watch. And I'm a pretty opinionated, mouthy guy. But in the past, I've given speeches on the conservative circuit and so on, and I have a conservative audience. But there are people in the background, maybe a guy at a bar giving drinks, or the tech guy, the audiovisual guy, and, may not think along with the majority in the room. You take my point. These are things to be mindful of. As for activism, I must say I'm not a great fan of college activism. Abbie Hoffman, the great activist in the 1960s, a so-called yippie, at the time, he was a very famous left-wing activist. And so the common phrase to apply to campuses then was, these are hotbeds of social unrest, hotbeds of social unrest. And when I was in college in the 1980s, Hoffman gave an interview on my campus in which he complained that campuses become hotbeds of social arrest, right? And I guess my idea is there's enough unrest just in the normal flow of life, just being a human being, dealing with grades and parents and friends and enemies and boyfriends and girlfriends and the whole flow of life. There can be enough unrest without unnecessary political agitation added on top of that. in my opinion. Another point, since I'm a big point maker here, and this is a funny thing for a loudmouth like me to say, but it's okay to keep quiet. You don't have to have an opinion on everything, express an opinion on everything. You don't have to participate. You don't have to be baited into it, egged into participating. You might say, I haven't really thought about that, or I need to study it more, or I don't know, I'm thinking it over, I don't have an opinion. I wish I'd known that more when I was younger. You have the right to remain silent, so to speak. You don't have to tell anyone who you voted for, by the way. We have a secret ballot in this country. What a blessed thing. It's really nobody's business. I thought of an anecdote I might share with you. This is from the days when I was about the age of most here, and I was an intern in the office of Senator Bob Dole in Washington. He was a major Republican. And Howard Baker was retiring from the Senate to run for president, and Dole was running for majority leader in the Senate, and running among his colleagues, that is, his Republican colleagues. And an aide to him, this is the semester I happened to be an intern, and an aide said to him, do you have the votes? Dole said, I have the promises, I have the pledges. I'm not sure I have the votes, because it was a secret ballot. But the point is, you don't have to tell anybody. Sometimes politics intrudes in your academic life, even if you don't want it to, because your professors are political. I found that. And I always thought it was wrong for a professor to use, or in my view, misuse his academic lectern as a political platform. But some do. And when I was in college, as I heard even some professors in the sciences, biology and so on, would sort of seize their lectern to talk about politics in Central America and elsewhere. I don't think this is especially kosher myself. And recently, I was in Cleveland visiting some friends. Friends of mine, they have 15-year-old twin girls, wonderful girls, and they go to a very good school. And they told me about, I think it was a history teacher, government teacher, social science, I can't remember, but a teacher. And people were very curious about his views, his personal views about politics. And he said, I'll tell you when you graduate, which I thought was kind of neat. Sometimes you know the professor's politics just because they're outspoken about them in their writings. And I want to make the point here that left-wing students can learn from right-wing professors and vice versa. Certainly I did. I think my most beloved, I was a conservative college student, I think my most beloved and important professor in college was a left-winger. The great historian Barbara J. Fields, who's a dear friend of mine today, and she was so patient with me. I haunted her office hours. She was so patient with me in my gibberish and my initial political enthusiasms and so on. And such a good teacher. I remember another one too, Emily Cloyd taught English. Johnson and Boswell was her field. And I said, I feel that, we conservatives are put upon on this campus. And she talked about being a graduate student at Columbia, when it was very uncool to be left-wing. And she said when we read The Nation, we would hide it. And I thought that was interesting to hear from her. Recently, I did a podcast and an event with two famous professors, Cornel West and Robert George, and a left-winger and a right-winger. And they're fast friends. And they team taught when they were both at Princeton, on the Princeton faculty. And they assigned very diverse readings in political theory. And I thought that was a neat way to go. And Cornel West in our podcast told me that his tutor at Harvard had been Robert Nozick, the great libertarian. And Cornel West is very far from that. But he adored Nozick and learned a lot from him. Let me quote something Robbie George said. He was talking about how he grew up and his education. He is from West Virginia. His dad was the son of Syrian immigrants, and his mother was the son of Italian immigrants. And both of his grandfathers had been coal miners. And here's what Professor George said. And then Robbie George himself, brilliant kid, went on to Swarthmore, Harvard, and Oxford. And he said to me, with the exception of one issue, I thought about nothing, despite having very firm convictions on everything. I thought about nothing but one issue, and that was abortion. It wasn't until I got to college and encountered a dialogue of Plato, the Gorgias, that I began to realize that tribal thinking was foolish, and it wasn't really thinking at all. I needed to start thinking. He said that when he grew up in his family, he said, we believed in four things: Jesus Christ, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic Party, and the United Mine Workers of America. A very interesting credo. And he always kept his roots, of course. We have our roots, but he broadened. Cornel West said he took a course in the famous Samuel Beer at Harvard. And he said, in that class, I read Max Weber, and it was life-changing. Weber's two great lectures from 1917 and 1919, they're at the center of what I do, that science as a vocation and politics as a vocation. He cuts across disciplines. He invokes Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. What's a professional sociologist doing talking about Russian novelists? He's an intellectual, you see, not an academic in a narrow sense. He knows, for example, what it is to wrestle with depression, and so on and so forth. Back to this issue of tribalism. It seems to be baked into the cake. Biologically, man is a tribal animal, it seems. Some people say a herd animal. You know the famous phrase, a herd of independent minds. And a real independent mind, I think it's something relatively rare. If I could recommend a book to you, published recently, translated into English recently, by Mario Vargas Llosa, the great Peruvian novelist and political essayist, The Call of the Tribe. It's about his intellectual formation. It's really an intellectual autobiography. And the thinkers who coaxed him out of tribalism, Hayek, Isaiah Berlin, Karl Popper, George Orwell, so on and so forth. But the call of the tribe can be so strong, this business of red jerseys and blue jerseys. We sometimes have to fight for independent-mindedness. Now, I'd like to stress that to be independent-minded doesn't mean to be neutral or to be a centrist. You can have very strong opinions, even extreme opinions, and be independent-minded. All that means is you've arrived at your opinions independently and aren't towing a party line, a movement line, a tribal line, which can shift on you. Today, this is our line. Oh, now we believe the opposite, so now this is our line. So I'm wearing the same color jersey all the time. What the jersey believes today is what I have to subscribe to because it's my team. I once asked Eugene Genovese, the great US historian, why he'd been kicked out of the Communist Party at age 20. And he shrugged and said, I zigged when I should have zagged. Communists were always changing the line, and he might not have known what the line was that day. This is something to beware. A little bit more about Bill Buckley. He was a great conservative. He is widely regarded as the founder of the modern American conservative movement, but he had friendships with all and sundry. And one of his dearest friends was John Kenneth Galbraith, the social democratic economist. They vacationed together, they debated, they were on a circuit, they were dear, dear friends. Also, he and George McGovern, the 1972 Democratic presidential nominee, they were good friends, and they did a kind of road show together. And I met lots of left-wingers at Bill Buckley's table, left-wingers and liberals. Mario Cuomo, the governor of New York, Gary Trudeau, the cartoonist, David Halberstam, the journalist, and so on and so forth. Maybe a final word about this business of reading widely. I always counsel, and this may be more a matter of do as I say, but I always counsel a diverse media diet. I've heard this term in recent years, siloization. Everyone's in his own media silo. Everyone curates his own media. We used to have media in common. Maybe it wasn't as good a day, but there were 3 major television networks plus PBS. There were a couple of dominant newspapers that the other newspapers took inspiration from. It was a different media world. Now you can be in your own silo. And it takes real discipline, I think, to put fiber in your diet, so to speak, to read some things you may not like, at least initially, to read some things that cut across the grain. This is something I urge for everyone. It makes you broader. It's also very important, I think, to find honest journalists, by which I mean journalists who aren't tribesmen, sort of working for the tribe. someone who doesn't necessarily care what the reading public thinks. What he's going after is what he thinks is true and right, and he lets the political chips fall where they may. I mentioned earlier George Will. There are always times when the right is mad at him. There are times when the left is mad at him. He doesn't really care. He's like a honey badger. He doesn't care. He just goes straight ahead, and he has an appreciative audience. So I think of it almost like a tasting menu. Just dip in here and there. Take a little of this, a little of that, and see what you think. And maybe it's possible to narrow down when you're older, but I certainly think when you're starting out, get acquainted with everything. We used to have, this is very old-fashioned, but a periodicals room. I adored that room. And all the magazines were in these plastic covers. And newspapers were on sticks, so you wouldn't walk away with them. And it's a good way to learn about the world. Here at the end, before we open it up, and I have notes that go on, but I thought I might say that I'm a pretty opinionated guy. I have very strong opinions about policy, domestic and foreign. But what I most care about is our democracy, our constitutional republic, what my friend David French calls the frame, the constitutional frame, the structure in which we live or ought to live. I want this to hold so that we live to fight another day, so to speak. I believe in all that Betsy Ross stuff, all that American founding stuff. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, so on and so forth. And it's a job of the government to secure these rights. I think it's important for Americans to be concerned more about the process, the structure, than the result or the outcome. Because we all lose some, we all win some. And the point about being an American, at least an American Democrat with a small d, is that you respect the process, the procedure, the rule of law, whether you like the outcome or not. Next time you may like the outcome. There's an old-fashioned phrase, a nation of laws, not men. Men meaning all people. So all of this is standard 4th of July stuff, and it's corny, but I still believe it, and I think that's enough talking from me, and let's now have a discussion. Say whatever you want. If you don't raise your hand, I may call on you. I'm glad you did raise your hand.
So you mentioned that you're against, or at least hesitant for politics on campus so we can learn. Is debate not an important part of learning?
Learning, I would say no. It's part of performance. But what you gather before you debate is learning. I'm all for debating. I'd be very sure I knew what I was talking about. No? But my opinion, which is a minority opinion, is there's time enough for that later. Life is so long. And do you debate to sharpen your rhetorical skills, your forensic skills? That'd be one thing. I'm not sure the answer to that. I respect debate. I was something of a debater myself. But I tell you, some of the things I wrote and published when I was younger, I wince at to read now and wouldn't like them widely disseminated because my luggage has shifted in transit. But you couldn't have told me then. But sure, I would say people are on a solid footing and well-grounded. Why not? Debate away. But you may change your mind next week. I guess what I'm saying is don't be too dug in too early, except on the basics, such as freedom, human rights, democracy, so on and so forth. Is that a bad answer? I see a look of disapproval on your face, but give me more, give me more.
Yeah. Well, I somewhat agree with what you're saying. However,
I appreciate the somewhat.
yeah,
I'll take what I can get.
I just think that in order to make even the claims of like you should care about democracy, human rights, freedom, you have to have some kind of value in that. If someone doesn't, then you have to debate that. Do you not? So you're.
Do you? Do you really? Can you let the guy learn on his own?
Well, how?
Or do you have to instruct him?
it's not necessarily instructing, but if you're in a conversation with someone and you guys disagree on something.
Oh, sorry. I misunderstood you. When you said debate, I was thinking formal debate, like a debate
No,
club.
not formal
Ah,
debate, just like
you mean
conversational
talking.
debate.
You mean conversating, as we
Yes.
said in the neighborhood. Oh, sorry. I thought you meant, I study up, I stand here, you study up, you stand there, we debate, and there's a judge. Or...
That's my fault.
Oh. I would say if two people enjoy it, let them have at it. If that's what they like, sure. There's an old expression, it takes two to have an argument. And it takes two to tango. And if both guys want to tango, great. I find I'm liking it a little bit less as I go along. But if it floats your boat, why not? But, so this could be insulting to young people. I'm going to insult my audience, proving that I'm a journalist. I'd go into a class when I was in college. The professor, the first day, the first minute would say, we're all going to learn from each other. And I would say, I don't want to learn from these kids who are puking back at the dorm. I want to learn from someone, I want to learn from someone who knows something. These bozos don't have anything to teach. I just couldn't stand that kind of professor. No, we're all going to learn from each other. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but only a little bit. But you couldn't have stopped me from debating, as you say. For $1 million wouldn't have stopped me from running my mouth. But yeah, it's all part of maturation, I would say. But beware of civil war. I would say, and be prepared to let your hair down after a while and say, let's watch a movie on Netflix. Is that okay? Semi-acceptable?
I think so.
Still not happy.
I'm like you. I have a lot of strong opinions, so.
Yeah, it's a curse in life, trust me.
It really is.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, yes. So one thing I
What
found.
enviable hair.
Oh, thank you.
My God, I'd like just like a half a foot of it. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. So yeah, one thing that you said that I thought was pretty interesting was
There was one thing? Good.
there were a
no,
good
no,
bit
no,
of
I
things
appreciate
actually,
that.
but one thing that is just coming to mind right now was when you said that teachers and professors in general shouldn't necessarily bring their political convictions to class. So like a lot of us in here are probably political science.
They can bring them to class. I would say force them on others because students can be hostages. You're hostage. You're just sitting there.
Okay.
Someone hammering you about his politics. I think it's not so cool, but go ahead.
Gotcha. Well, I guess like going off that then, with certain issues that are maybe a little bit more politically charged than others, and also ones where, you're kind of like objectively analyzing certain policy, how would you kind of balance like having like a partisan like sentiment that's maybe you're really passionate about as like a professor, and you have a class that's maybe like not receptive to that?
I would want to assign all sides, reading, presenting all sides. And so giving people a kind of tasting menu, and then maybe they can see what they like. I think that's the most honest approach. I think of Harvey Mansfield, the famous political theory teacher at Harvard, who was just retired at age 91, I think. So he would do this big political theory survey from the ancients, the Greeks and Romans, medieval and modern. And he always, when he taught all these guys, in that lecture, he was an advocate for the particular thinker's point of view. He would have that thinker put his best foot forward, so to speak, even ones he couldn't stand, like Marx or Nietzsche. He would want them to have a fair hearing. This is the best of them, and this is why people who favor that school or that line do. This is what they think about it. So to me, a good teacher doesn't tell me what to think, he teaches me how to think. This is one thing I loved about Bill Buckley, whom I keep mentioning. It's not that he taught me what to think, but he was instrumental in showing me how to think, how he reasoned things out, whatever our own conclusions.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It's been very interesting. The U is known as like a public university, and so politics tends to influence campus a bit more, I would say. So if politics influences some university students in a negative way, How should these students navigate the situation if politics shouldn't be really involved on campus?
Yeah, how should students what, sorry?
Manage this situation?
Oh, it's so tricky. It's so tricky. I think you have to navigate every day. I think it's okay to say in all humility, I'm a student here taking courses, learning about things. I'm not running for office. I'm not campaigning. I don't need to be put on the political spot. It's absurd. There's too much pressure on it. There are enough pressures when you're young without that pressure. I think if students can, if they want to, I'm not talking about us political junkies. If students want to absent themselves from politics, I think they ought to be able to. You have a right to political expression. I think you have a certain right to be free of politics in certain situations, so the politics doesn't saturate everything. And I think a student should be able to say, oh, that's not for me, or I'm thinking about that, or that's not my interest right now. And there's not a thing wrong with that. But there peer pressure, the pressure to participate in the pressure to conform is great. By the way, it exists when you're older too, even when you're my age, it exists. That peer pressure, the pressure to conform, to get with the program, to go with the flow. This is what the tribe is doing now. The tribe is thinking this. The tribe is saying this. The tribe is doing this. Are you a faithful tribesman or not? I think you ought to be allowed to be an individual. And the primacy, and people have a right to conscience. And one of my most fervently held principles is a right to conscience, freedom of conscience. And often you have to assert it because other people aren't so eager to give you it, in my experience. I hope that wasn't too dramatic. That was slightly emotional.
We'll go back here. Hello, thank you. Thank you for being here. I feel like there might be a bit of an individualistic approach to the things that you're saying.
A bit of? It's absolutely. It's at the center of my political thinking.
Yeah. Well, what I'm
an anti-collectivist.
Yeah. What I'm trying to reach here is that very often there are things that we need to approach not as an individual, but as a.
Who says you? This is a serious point. Who decides? You?
Well, for instance, in politics, you need constituents, right? And you need people to vote the same way in such ways or whatnot for being progressive or having some sort of thing. And here's
you mean if you're running for office?
What was that?
What do you mean constituents when you're running for office?
Well, what I'm saying is just if you're running for office and you need to get reelected and all these things, what I'm trying to say though is just sometimes we have issues that are more important that simply having this individualistic idea of just being yourself and just simply not engaging civically around each other. And I agree with you, that you should not put your opinions on other people, but when does it become like you forcing your opinion into someone and then rather just you expressing your opinion? Because you were saying professors, whenever they come to class, they should not be forcing their opinions. But then when is it forcing? When do you say forcing, and when is it simply you are approaching what things are happening in the world or things are happening in your community?
I guess I would think I'd have to have specifics, but I think that a teacher should teach the material and in the classroom. And if he wants to write opinion columns, which I do pretty much every day of my life, that's on his own time. You know what I mean? But I'm not sure that's for classroom time. So I say, I think people should elect Smith instead of Jones. Well, I'm not sure I should use class time for that. Although I have a perfect right as a citizen to write things and to speak at public forums and so on. Maybe I'm misunderstanding you. I beg your pardon.
Well, my whole thing was This was just a bit of a tangent. I apologize. I should have made my question more clear.
No, it's all right.
There's
My
what I'm
whole
trying to say
talk
is
was a
like
tangent.
often just being an individual, taking on an individualistic approach can be regretful later on in life whenever you have like things that are like important, such as climate change, that things that I could have like that
Oh.
could have been prevented much farther like
Oh,
behind.
please don't
others.
misunderstand me. I think if a person feels compelled to stand up against injustice, for example, do. I spent my life doing this. Do. But that is an individual choice.
What do you consider injustice, though? Like
Where do we start?
Because wouldn't it be like if I tell you what I consider injustice?
Genocide of the Uyghurs, maybe?
Yeah, but
Start with that.
Would what I consider injustice, such as like, for instance, would I consider injustice, and I tell you what I consider injustice, then you might think that that is like a political argument, and then that I should keep that to myself. But then at that point, it would be like,
I didn't mean, sorry, I don't want to be misunderstood. If you don't want to keep things to yourself, don't. If you do, do. That was my point. I wasn't advocating the muzzling of anyone. I'm just saying if you don't have a firm opinion about something and don't want to be drawn into some debate, stand your ground and say no thank you. But heavens, if you do, have at it. Go nuts. Yeah. No, I'm not for anyone shutting up. I think there's a time and place for everything. But if you feel strongly about something, say so. And say why. Why
You're
not?
saying get all the facts, learn while you can.
As much as you can.
And then later in life is the time that you can do something with that knowledge. But if you
That's
do
what I have
things
found.
now
That's what I have
without
found.
knowing, that's what you're saying. It's just gather all the facts you have while you're in college.
It's really a unique period. It doesn't really come around later unless you're wealthy, and you can spend your time reading books and maybe, taking classes and so on. It's just, I hope I haven't misunderstood you. I don't see any satisfaction on your face. Give it one more shot, because I'm so stubborn, I can't bear to give it up. Give it one more shot.
No. I honestly think that it is such a broad topic, and there's just so many like what ifs, and there's so many simples, like just conditions that can be broken in your argument. And since like because you're not really like you're not really saying something like don't do this or do that. You're saying like if you want to, you should not be able. You should not.
I'm also cautioning too about being too political in this period of life. Part of it's personal. Boy, did I love politics. Too much.
I feel the same way as well. Like that's why it kind of feels like
We're birds of a feather.
because I feel like there are very important things that you have to do with civic engagement, and it is not necessary.
I wouldn't argue with you, but let me just tell you, let that wonderful copious hair down now and then. I had a lot of it too. Yeah. Otherwise, you'll wind up like me, a sleepless wreck, thinking about politics. Yeah.
Okay, I have another question right back here.
So you talked about kind of at the beginning the like depoliticization of our like everyday lives and like what you eat and what you wear and everything. And you also talked about, of course, professors not kind of pushing their politics within a lecture. Mm-hmm. And my question is, where do we draw the line for what is political? Because you talk about just teaching the material, but unfortunately, like today we see people, like if you teach that a historical event happened, then some people will say that's a political statement. And like that more and more things are becoming contested. And so at what point is the material political? Like where do you draw that line?
I don't know. It would depend on the facts of the case. I think readings ought to be diverse, as I said. And of course, politics comes up in all sorts of fields. But there's a certain objectivity that goes to it. Marx says this, Milton Friedman says this. These are free market arguments. These are socialist arguments. And I would assign the best of both sides, or all sides. I wouldn't have chumps or straw men. I would take their best representatives, their best exponents, their best articulators. This is what I think we ought to read, certainly in college. But you can't take controversy out of them. Controversy is part of life, absolutely.
And so I guess just to like take that argument.
I'm not that pure. I'm not that pure. I just argue for a little bit less ideology, a little less. It's the aforementioned Bill Buckley was always quoting Talleyrand. Surtout pas trop de zèle. Above all, not too much zeal. And college campuses are a great place for zealotry. I feel it within myself. I still do. But you learn to curb it.
Yeah, I guess just like, because I absolutely agree with that statement, just kind of like to the extreme point of like, for example, if a professor is teaching history, are they obligated to assign reading from Holocaust deniers? Like
no,
like
I say no.
You know,
absolutely not. Flat earthers, absolutely not. You could say this is why, what's his name thought the sun revolved around the earth. That's good. But no. Chesterton said something like, the purpose of an open mind is to close it on some things. Yeah. I know there should be no place for outright lies. Yeah. Things that are provable and disprovable. I got you. I got your drift. Yeah. As we said in the 70s, I know where you're coming from. What an antique phrase.
I just kind of want to go back to the point of like how you agree, like we should be educated on politics, but we should maybe save it
on everything. But yeah,
yeah, in general, and save it and use it for later. Especially right now, where all of a sudden we are voting citizens, and my vote counts just as much as your vote. But I'm maybe naive to politics and my own ideology and beliefs in that. How can we? I agree to some aspects of politics doesn't belong on campus. I don't think that you should be forced into any political front. But where this is our...
Can I just interrupt for a second? Don't forget, my talk is titled Politics on Campus, Yes and No.
Yeah.
Not none. But
sure.
Keep going.
Yeah. Do you think that there's just like a general way to educate people through either a required gen ed course that like teaches about all different political parties, and it kind of just, that creates less hostility in that aspect of understanding? Do you think that there's other ways to go about it? Because I feel like just not including it or having less of it on campus it's kind of a cycle. It doesn't really help the fact that we are naive to politics.
I believe in a core curriculum myself. And it's possible to teach politics without, advocating current positions or this candidate or that candidate. It's possible to teach government that way. And how do you learn about this stuff? Through reading and observing. A great diversity of media. And I'm glad I read on the left, I think I read The Nation and Mother Jones and In These Times, and there were some centrist liberal things, and I read conservative magazines and right-wing magazines. I was a junkie. Not everyone should be that heavy. Who has the time, first of all? I just loved it. And over time you learn about the world. And maybe I'm getting a little bit sentimental, but at my stage of life, I've sort of gone back to school. I'm consuming less journalism and reading more books now. And there's something I've been saying the last few years, because it's come to me so strongly, just dealing with people. There's an old expression, you are what you eat. And I've taken to saying, you are the media you consume. I can tell the media people consume by the way they talk at me. I can just tell. And I'll say it for the 5th time, I am a really opinionated, obnoxious guy. But I'm aware of what other opinions there are and why people hold them. I think that's important.
Sure.
Yeah. And if I had my way, I'd eat only hot fudge sundaes with no carrots and peas and granola. I'd just eat cream-filled donuts and read the columnists and the others I love. And I forced myself to do the other. I forced myself to eat my vegetables.
So kind of based off of that, I guess, because I believe that there's a huge problem with overconsumption in media, specifically like our generation, whether that's politics or anything else. And then there's also issues with fake news in that aspect. Is there ways that, or like different sources that you have found are the most reliable, or things that you think that are
I like to
better
read
teach
wire
everything?
services. They're not perfect, but I like to read the Associated Press. But also, caveat emptor, buyer beware. And you have to be a savvy shopper in media as in everything else. Be a savvy shopper. What rings true to you? Do you think someone's selling you a bill of goods? Also, when it comes to media bias, we know where bias lies. Most lies in commission and omission. What issues are they ignoring? Huh? What are they leaving out? And so this is why I wish there were like one-stop shopping, a news source, a news and opinion source, a one-stop shopping. This is what you need. That'd be easy. There really isn't. You have to cast around a little. It's a pain. It's laborious.
You have time for about one more question over here.
We can talk after too if you like.
National Review Institute here. It says that one of your core values is defending Western civilization. Would you please define that? Defending Western civilization. What is Western civilization?
I think most people would say it's what comes from Athens and Jerusalem, that whole tradition, what comes from the Enlightenment, individual rights, abolishing a sort of system based on birth, station, heredity, throne and altar.
So what's an example of a not Western civilization?
I'll give you civilizations that aren't in the West. They all have riches. They all have riches. Chinese civilization, Japanese civilization, African civilization, and so on. And I'm for the whole feast, for the whole banquet. But probably what the writer of that thing meant was the political freedoms, what we call liberalism, classical liberalism. Constitutionalism, the rule of law, separation of powers, freedom of expression, freedom of worship or non-worship, an independent judiciary, trial by jury, so on and so forth. Well, that's a momentous question, which J.M. Roberts and Kenneth Clark and others have spent so much time on. And also, this is something you all know, but the West isn't necessarily a geographic term. It can be a political term as well. Look at the two Koreas. Same people, same DNA, same ancestry, same customs, same food to the extent the North Koreans can eat. Utterly different countries with different values. I know this is dissatisfying, I can tell, but it's the best shot I can give it right now.
Yeah, I guess I read it as being racist.
I understand.
Defending Western. I read it as white man's civilization.
Do you think so? Well, don't you think Shakespeare and Bach and Dante and Beethoven and Mozart and the rest of them, don't you think they belong to everyone? They're universal. Personally, I think so-called Western values are human ones, or universal ones, and humane values. But I take your point. I'll take your point. But maybe
Western civilization, it's like we're superior.
And I take your point. But today, here and now, I'll be responsible for my own words. But I get where you're coming from. I truly do. Anybody else?
That's going to conclude our time today.
All right.
But Jay did say he'll be sticking around if anyone you have any questions. But please
thank you, everybody.
Please join me in thanking Jay. Thank you all so much for coming today.